The BCTF's work around equity, diversity, and inclusion is something that I'm incredibly proud of, and I hope is a source of great pride for you too. After all, the progress we've made has only been possible through the work and support of our membership. However, oftentimes we get so caught up in the work, doing the work itself, that we forget to step back and tell the story of the bigger picture and how all the pieces fit together. So that's what I'd like to do today, to share the story of where we came from and where we're going in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion here at the BCTF. Some of the delegates at this meeting have been to many AGMs and RAs and are likely familiar with many of the decisions that led us to where we find ourselves today. For others, however, this may be your first time hearing about some of these decisions and the work that helped us arrive at them. Regardless of where you're coming from in terms of familiarity, my aim is to help paint a clear picture of why we are on this path, whose voices have guided this work, the changes that have been made as a direct result of recommendations from members of equity-seeking groups, and what we have to look forward to as part of the Federation's continued commitment to this important work. There are also quite a few folks among the delegates here today that have been involved with this work in some capacity, be it through participating in an issue session, advisory panel, focus group, or even just by completing a survey. I want to thank each of you for answering the call, for sharing the truths of your diverse lived experiences, including the challenges and barriers you face, and for helping us to understand how we as a federation can do better in not only representing the interests of all members, but also in working to create safer, more supportive spaces for marginalized voices. We've prepared a backgrounder to accompany this presentation. That PDF contains a much more detailed timeline of the work I'll be touching on today, including dates so that you can find the complete minutes of meetings where these decisions were made, as well as PDFs of the full reports from the key member engagement initiatives that have guided this work. I encourage all of you to take some time to familiarize yourselves with these materials for more details on the impetus, paths, and outcomes of each of these initiatives. I'd like to start by bringing your attention to the BCTF Statement of Principles on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, as passed by the 2017 AGM. These are important truths we should keep in mind as we consider and vote on recommendations and motions relating to equity, diversity, and inclusion here at this AGM. You'll also find the Statement of Principles at the back of your Reports and Resolutions booklet, both in the print and the online version. In recent years, we've begun to deepen our collective understanding of the complex and pervasive issues of inequity, racism, and discrimination within our union, and have also begun taking steps to dismantle the structures and systems that have perpetuated these injustices. By standing up for what's right and fighting for justice is nothing new to us as BC teachers. The Federation has a long history of taking a strong stance on issues that were seen as highly controversial at the time. For example, 20 years before passing the Statements of Principles, the 1997 BCTF AGM voted on a motion for the BCTF to create a program to eliminate homophobia and heterosexism within the BC school system. I imagine there will be some of you today that remember this day vividly. I know I do. It was one of my first AGMs. For those who perhaps were still in school yourselves at the time, you may be surprised by what transpired. Just 25 years ago, our fight against homophobia was considered courageous. This is a real headline from a newspaper article in the Vancouver Sun, entitled, "Teachers Move to Tackle Homophobia in Province's Schools. The bid to end discrimination against gays and lesbians is hailed as a courageous step." It was also considered contentious, another real headline from the Vancouver Sun. "Demonstrators face off over homosexuality issue. a program to stop homophobia in schools brings opponents and advocates to meet BCTF. I'd like to share an excerpt from this story. About 150 gay youth and their supporters rallied outside the BC Teachers Federation Annual General Meeting Sunday to encourage the almost 700 delegates to pass a proposed resolution today against homophobia. In an earlier demonstration against the resolution, about 80 people turned out, some carrying offensive signs saying, "Stop homosexual recruitment in schools." This work can be uncomfortable, and it can be difficult. But over and over again, BC teachers have proven to be on the right side of history with the passage of time. BCTF members have done some truly incredible work over many decades on behalf of and in support of, and indeed hand in hand with, equity-seeking groups. Just a few brief examples are here. As you can see, the Task Force on the Status of Women, when we established the program in 1975, we raised issues of racism in schools and established the program against racism. We then had a task force in Aboriginal education and established the Aboriginal education program. For the purposes of contextualizing some of the items before this year's AGM, I'm going to jump ahead to 2014, where the AGM carried a motion for the Federation to undertake an equity audit. The equity audit work took place over 2 years and included input and consultation from the Committee for Action on Social Justice and multiple focus groups with members of equity-seeking groups and BCTF advisory committees. We also conducted member surveys and engaged with other Canadian teacher unions and did a thorough literature review. The Executive Committee received a presentation and report upon the completion of the audit. And through that report, which is included as part of the backgrounder on the event Moby, we heard from members of equity-seeking groups who generously shared their experiences. What they shared with us is that there was a lack of shared responsibility for equity issues, that the likelihood of members from equity-seeking groups encountering discrimination, racism, and exclusion was high, that there were generalizations and assumptions made by colleagues based on stereotypes and a general lack of attention to the needs of the minorities. We also heard that actions that ranged from misunderstanding to more overt racism and exclusion were occurring, that members from minority or equity-seeking groups felt vulnerable and that they must prove themselves all the time. And what was also noted is the critical importance of allies and union leaders who will advocate, show an interest, and speak up for minorities. The report documented for the Federation an undeniable imperative for change. And I quote, "This is complex work that may sometimes be controversial or uncomfortable, especially when it involves thoughtfully examining privilege and power in relation to equity and inclusion. However, it is work that must be undertaken both as an ethical imperative and in the long-term interest of the strength and viability of the BCTF." That's directly from the Diversity and Equity and Inclusion audit report in 2016. 16 motions were carried by the Executive Committee based on the report and its recommendations, including formalizing a long-term commitment to this work by looking internally at our leadership and union structures, as well as acknowledging the importance of enhancing members' understanding of these critical issues. As a white woman, I don't know anything about what it's like to experience racism firsthand, nor do any of my white colleagues, because as we know, racism involves both prejudice and power and is ingrained in our Eurocentric institutions and social structures. This is just one of the reasons why it's critically important for us to create opportunities to hear directly from those who do know, and for us to truly listen, not only to their experiences, but also to their recommendations, what they feel must happen to create the change necessary for them to feel safe, supported, valued, and to have a true voice at the table. We're probably all familiar with this image, at least the equality and equity components. However, in both of these images, the barrier, a tall fence, remains. When the barrier itself is seen as the issue and the necessary work is done to remove that barrier, everyone can participate freely, just as they are, without requiring a boost to access the same opportunities as others. But until we have successfully torn down all those barriers within our union structures and processes that exclude or silence Indigenous members, Black members, and members of color, as well as members of all marginalized identities, not necessarily by intention, but certainly by design, we must do the next best thing, which is to take steps towards what is referred to here as liberation through our commitment to equity work. I want to make it abundantly clear that this commitment isn't just mine or that of the current executive. This is the Federation's commitment, and it's your commitment. Since the 2016 AGM, BCTF members have democratically shown their support for the Federation's diversity, equity, and inclusion work every year through the Federation leadership priorities. This work is central to who we are as teachers and as a Federation. 2017 is the year when the Federation really doubled down on our equity work with some significant resolutions carried at that AGM. These included the necessary changes to create an equitably representative and inclusive executive committee, and to adopt the Statement of Principles on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. In early 2019, the BCTF hosted its first issue session on racism, and then another one later in the year. Over 60 members who identified as Aboriginal, Indigenous, or teachers of color participated across the two sessions. Some important truths of their experiences were captured through these sessions. These were the key findings. Being a racialized teacher makes the job more challenging due to additional stressors from experiences of systemic racism and other forms of racism. Teachers describe that experiences of racism and their attempts to assimilate into the predominant Eurocentric work culture contribute to the development of or the exacerbation of mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, trauma, burnout, decreased confidence and feelings of anger, loneliness, exclusion, and of being overwhelmed. In addition, group participants discussed feeling silenced in their work environments because they fear negative employment repercussions if they talked about their experiences of racism honestly. The recommendations contained in these two reports from the issue sessions on racism resulted in some significant decisions from the Executive Committee, including for the Federation to increase the number of teachers of color in the internal mediation service and expand training to include identifying and addressing patterns of discrimination. That we should host additional issue sessions on racism, develop anti-colonial and anti-racist training resources and processes for all governance representatives, and to develop and provide tools for members to work to address unconscious bias, racism, and white fragility. Shortly thereafter, the Executive Committee carried a motion for the Federation to take a close look at its governance structures, to expose and remove the inequities that exist due to colonialism, white supremacy, and inaccessibility. Through the feedback received from the members of equity-seeking groups over several years, we were finally able to see that this wasn't simply a matter of educating ourselves and our members about racism and colonialism, but that significant structural changes needed to be made in order for the Federation to put an end to systemic discrimination, prejudice, and ableism within the democratic structures of our union. And of course, that this work must be done in collaboration with members who identify as Indigenous, Black, and people of color, and grounded in anti-racist practice. One of the initiatives that came out of this work was the task force on creating an equitable and inclusive representative assembly, which involved 20 members with representation across multiple equity-seeking groups throughout the province. And there were 25 recommendations that were submitted by the group that worked on this task force, some of which are still in the process of being implemented. Ad hoc, for example, still ongoing is the ad hoc committee to look to use an anti-oppressive lens to review the BCTF's simplified rules of order. This was also the task force that gave us the recommendation around an elder or a healer being at governance meetings. And this was also the task force that encouraged LRs to introduce themselves and for that time not to come out of their allotted speaking time. So the advisory panel to address racially discriminatory actions is the Federation's most recent member-driven initiative, and as part of this work to take a close and critical look at ourselves and our structures through an anti-oppression lens. The panel was tasked with making recommendations to the EC regarding a proposed scope of investigatory and adjudication procedures, consideration of the systemic barriers within the Federation that contribute to discriminatory actions, and procedural and constitutional changes to redress discriminatory conduct. Based on the panel's recommendations and a legal review, the Executive Committee carried a number of motions, including several of those before us today. And so one is that the EC recommend to the AGM that Bylaw 7.2 be amended to include 4 designated seats for BIPOC members on Judicial Council, that the EC recommend to the AGM the change to the Code of Ethics, Procedure 31B02, to add a new clause, which you'll see in your R&R book, and that is recommendation 50. Also, recommendation 51, that a procedure be deleted, and you'll see it in your R&R booklet. And also for the EC to recommend to this AGM that 4 designated BIPOC seats and a limit on term length be put in place. So the work across the Federation is ongoing as we continue to examine the ways in which Federation structures act as barriers to participation for members of equity-seeking groups. We presently have an ad hoc committee working towards advising the Executive Committee on changes to the rules of order and other systemic barriers within our decision-making bodies. And we'll soon be striking a committee to conduct a full review of the Judicial Council and internal mediation services, bylaws, policies, and procedures. Once again, this is because to be truly democratic, our union must be structured and governed in such a way that facilitates engagement, not act as a barrier to engagement. Needless to say, it's been a long journey to get us to where we are today with these recommendations. It's also been an incredibly important journey, and one that has forced us to face some difficult truths. These truths have compelled us to take action because it's the right thing to do. Having heard countless stories of racism, discrimination, exclusion, and prejudice, both within our schools and within our union, we can no longer sit back and allow it to continue. To do so would be unjust and undemocratic. Looking back, I'm so incredibly proud of the progress we have made together as a Federation. Looking ahead, I feel hopeful for what's still to come. This is a long journey, and one we're all on together. The Federation has made strong commitments to furthering equity and inclusion and to examine the structures, processes, and culture of the BCTF to promote agency and access for all members. Again, this has been reflected in the leadership priorities every year since 2016 and has been further affirmed in several significant member engagement projects related to this work. Something I'm particularly excited to see is an increase in the Federation's capacity to support this critical work towards systemic change with the creation of a new anti-racism and anti-oppression office in the 2022-2023 school year. In the months ahead, the Federation will be hiring a director, assistant director, and support staff dedicated to this work. As I wrap up, I want to bring your attention to this important reminder as we return to our work at this AGM, what it means to practice allyship. And that is currently on your screen. And just as we're looking at what it means to be an ally and what allyship is all about, I'd really like to thank Lauren Hutchinson, who really did an incredible job of putting together this presentation and also putting together the report that is in Event Mobi, which is a very comprehensive list of all the motions that are being passed over the years, including the reports that I have just mentioned. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. So I want to close off by extending my sincerest gratitude to all of those who have contributed their time, energy, and labor to help move the Federation in the right direction on this work. It's been such an honor to work alongside you and learn from you over my many years on the Executive Committee. And I just really want to thank everyone deeply for this work.